In this part of our tutorial, we're going to take the next step up by creating a void function, but this time it's going to take in a couple of parameters. So we're going to create this function, we'll call it function, and it will perform an operation again after taking in these two parameters, which will be integers. So the function will add the two integers that we pass in, and it will print out the results of this addition. In the previous part of our tutorial, we took a look at a simple function that just had a print statement. So when it was called in not the onCreate, but the viewDidLoad function in our iOS version, once it was called, all it did was print out the statement Mammoth Interactive. So it didn't have any parameters and it had a void return type. All it was doing when called was printing that statement out. Now we're going to take a look at a function that's the next step up. So this one's going to be a void return type also, but it's going to take in a couple of parameters. So let's see what this looks like. We'll first have to create our function, again, outside of the onCreate part, because this is where we're going to call the function. We can't assign the function inside of a function. So this one is going to be a public void, and we're going to call this one, let's just call it function. Okay, and we'll pass it, we'll set up the brackets and set up the curly brackets. So here we go, we've set our function up. We haven't yet passed it any parameters, and it's not yet doing anything. So let's go ahead and pass it some parameters. Let's say that this function is going to add a couple of integers together and then print out the result. So in order to do that, it would be a good idea to pass in a couple of integers as parameters. So we'll have integer a and integer b. Now, when I put these parameters in these brackets here, this isn't actually creating objects. This is basically just saying that every time you call this function, you have to pass it in two integers. I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. So let's complete this function. We'll say text, always does this, beauties of autofill. Okay, so we have our text label, and we're going to have it be, say, the results of the addition are, and then we'll have the results of the addition. Now we could add the two integers right in here, but I'm going to keep things simple and just say integer c equals a plus b. Okay, so this is just adding whatever two integers we input, storing them in this integer c, and then we're going to say this is, I'm going to say plus c dot toString. So this is basically going to print this out, and it's going to print out c, and once it's converted to a string. And what kind of error are we guessing here? Text doesn't exist, and that's because we haven't called it yet. So our next step will be to call this function. So if we call function, so previously we just had function being called like this, and we didn't have any parameters to pass it in. However, if we do this, we get this error. It's saying there's no argument given that corresponds to the required, let's zoom in, required formal parameter a of main activity function. So this is saying that basically we're not passing in any arguments where we should be passing in arguments. So let's go ahead and do that now. If we pass it in, for example, 5 and 3, then all this is doing is it is giving 5 and 3 to this function. So it's saying integer a is 3, integer a is 5, and integer b is 3. And then it's going to add the 2, and the results are, and then we're going to have c and then toString. And because we're trying to call text and it doesn't exist, I'm just going to move this out to the top here. So you remember we talked about global and local variables? Well, this right now has just become a global variable. Before it was local when it was in this function, which is why we were getting this error here. So on that note, every time we create a variable within a function, it's generally what we call a local variable, which means it can't be accessed outside of that function. So for example, if I create this integer c, and then I try to maybe create a function that manipulates c in some way, we're going to get some kind of an error. Notice how if I didn't include this line up here, and I just had text view, then it may be fine in here, but then we get this error here saying that the name text doesn't exist. Again, because this is now a local variable rather than a global variable, so it's not recognized between functions. So here we go. If we do that, then we should be fine. So let's go ahead and run this, and we have our function call. So basically this is going to, just to give you a rundown before we run it, the onCreate function is going to run, it's going to call our function, and it's going to pass in 5 as the first parameter and 3 as the second one. Then this function is going to say, okay, we're passed in 5 and then 3. It's going to add 5 and 3 and store the results in C, which should be 8. And then it's going to print out the results of this addition are, and then C, and we're going to convert that to a string. So basically it should say the results of this addition are 8. Rather, perhaps let's use proper English. Say the result of this addition is. Okay, good stuff. Let's go ahead and run this. So we're just going to wait for it to start up. It can be a little slow if it's the first time we're running it. Oh, it was actually very fast. And here we get printed out, the result of the addition is 8, and that's exactly right. So if we were to pass in this function something else, so let's say we pass in 10, and run it again, then we should get a different result, but it's basically doing the same thing. And we get 13, because 10 plus 3 is 13. So this is a good thing about parameters, is that you can create these, the best thing is that you can create these local variables and pass them in without having to make them global. And also, this way we can keep values consistent throughout functions. And I'll show you a little bit more about exactly what I mean by that later on, but it's a little advanced. So for now, these are parameters, and not every function needs them, but they're good when we need to pass in variables to manipulate them within the function. In this part of our tutorial, we introduced a void function, but this time we passed it in a couple of parameters. So we created this function called function, and we added the two numbers passed into it. So we passed in two integers and added them together as we passed them in as parameters, and then we created an integer within the function, and that was the result of the addition, and then we printed that out at the end. We also talked a little about global and local variables. So again, global variables are created outside of functions, so they're generally at the top of the code, whereas local variables are created within functions and can only be accessed or really exist within that function. So outside of it, the code doesn't really recognize it. So by now you should be able to pass parameters into functions and manipulate them, as well as make function calls with parameters. So we use 2 this time. You can have as many as you want. You can pass in many parameters, or again you can pass in no parameters like we saw a couple videos ago.